Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Welcome to our panel discussion today on what role is there for the European Media Freedom Act in Central Europe. My name is Zsuzsanna Vég. I'm a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund in its Engaging Central Europe program, and I will be moderating this discussion today. So at the Engaging Central Europe program, one of our key focus is monitoring and discussing the challenges democracies face in the region of Central Europe. And of course, one of the cornerstones of a well-functioning democracy is media freedom and pluralism. So naturally, the European Media Freedom Act is of key concern and interest for us, and we would like to explore today what this new currently forming European legislation can do for the countries of the region which are facing challenges in the field of media pluralism and media freedom as well. For this assessment and also in-depth exploration of several country cases, we have today with us three excellent speakers. In alphabetical order, Konrad Breyer-Simon, who is a research associate at the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom at the European University Institute, with a great overview, not only of the forming legislation, but also having worked on the Media Pluralism Monitor, also a great overview on the challenges on the media landscape in various European countries. We also have with us today Boriana Rambazova, who is a member of the board at the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria, with experience of investigative journalism, as well as great knowledge of the media landscape in the country of Bulgaria. And she will focus on sharing her expertise with us, both in terms of the country as well as the overall regulatory landscape. And last but not least, we have with us Anna Vujicic, a postdoctoral researcher at the Polish Academy of Sciences, who also happens to be our former Rethink CE fellow, who focused on media pluralism and media freedom, specifically in the countries of Poland and Hungary. So warm welcome to all three of you. I also need to mention that today's discussion takes place in under the umbrella of the AUTHLIB project. AUTHLIB is an EU-funded Horizon project led by the Central European University with the precise title Neo-Authoritarianisms in Europe and the Liberal Democratic Response. Just like the focus of our Engaging Central Europe program, this AUTHLIB project is also focusing on exploring present-day challenges to democracy, liberal democracy in Central Europe and beyond. And for that reason, it's a great match to bring together both AUTHLIB and our ECE programming on this occasion. So before diving into the assessment of what the European Media Freedom Act can do for the countries of Central Europe, just a few words on what this legislation is. So the European Media Freedom Act seeks to set up a comprehensive legal framework to promote media pluralism and media freedom in Europe and establish an EU-wide legislation. It was proposed by the European Commission, put forward in its proposal form last year. Some of the key issues it seeks to tackle are protecting media pluralism and independence, preventing political interference and surveillance into editorial practices. It seeks to increase protection for journalists, journalistic sources. It also might establish a European Board of Media Services that would seek to enforce this EU-wide legislation under a new institutional framework. And also it would seek to ensure adequate funding for public service media, as well as transparency of media ownership. So just from this very brief list, you can see that the legislation is quite broad and vast, and is certainly a major step on the European level. To really explore that and explore the pros and cons of such a framework, first we would like to discuss with our speakers how they see the opportunities and challenges of the EU-wide legislation. And in a second round of contributions, we will also dive into the specific country cases, how the European Media Freedom Act may address problems in Central Europe, specifically in the countries of Hungary, Poland, and Bulgaria. So without further ado, and thank you for bearing with me for so long, I would now pass the floor first to Anna and ask her to catch us up to speed. Where is the Media Freedom Act standing right now? What are the next steps? And I would also be interested in your assessment about its strengths and weaknesses.
Thank you so much for this invitation. So I would like to briefly start by saying that the EU in general is the best place for journalists to do their work in terms of safety and media freedom, but these conditions vary considerably across countries, and we have recently seen it in the new Reporters Without Borders ranking, which is topped by actually non-EU country, but by Norway. However, the next spots, 8 spots, are occupied by EU member states. However, there are certain member states that are lagging in this ranking, and these are the rule of law backsliding democracies, notably Poland and Hungary. So Poland ranks 57th in this ranking, and Hungary occupies the 72nd position. And we've seen that this position is not only linked to those countries' geographical location, because other countries in Central Europe that joined the EU 19 years ago, such as Czech Republic, Slovakia, are performing significantly better. They are on the 14th and 17th place. So the European Media Freedom Act is a response, as Zsuzsi just said, to worrying trends in media freedom across the EU. And it's a part of a broader democracy safeguarding package that is being cherished and promoted by the current Vice President of the European Commission, Vera Jourova, and the Commissioner for Internal Market, Thierry Breton. So why this whole package came to be? It is first due to democratic backsliding, that is most pronounced in Poland and Hungary, and second, because the European public opinion was shocked by murders of journalists, Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta in 2017, and Jan Kuciak and his fiancée Martina Kuśnierova in Slovakia in 2018. So ever since, the EU has been doing more to try to establish first monitoring, and it has many instruments such as the European Media Pluralism Monitor that is conducted, it's a study conducted at the European University Institute, and since 2020 also through the annual rule of law reports that include a section on media freedom. But the European Commission has been grasping with this problem that very few the very few media issues are actually covered by EU law, because traditionally EU law has led it to national authorities to regulate media issues. And all EU member states are in the Council of Europe, which is an older organization, one of the main human rights organizations in Europe and in the world. And since decades, the Council of Europe, specifically the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, has been issuing recommendations regarding public media, media regulators, media market, etc. And these are very detailed, but they are only soft law. So states are not sanctioned for failing to comply with them. So against this this background, the European Commission has been working on this new legislation named the European Media Freedom Act, and it has presented a draft in September 2022. The act is now in a more advanced stage of legislative process. So the European Parliament and the EU member states in the Council are scrutinizing the text and working on their respective positions that will be in the form of amendments. And there are consultations in the European Parliament's committees. In March, the first draft opinion was presented by the Committee on the Internal Market. And the Council, so the governments of member states, is a little bit more advanced in trying to make some proposals. However, there is not end in sight yet, but the EU institutions and the governments will be pressured to finalize the proposal for the European Media Freedom Act ahead of the European Parliament elections that will take place in May 2024. So we expect to see the final draft at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year. And just very briefly, so the pros of the whole European Media Freedom Act from the perspective of democracy safeguarding within the EU is that actually there is some action and some proposals, so the problem is noticed. And it gives some hope that it will give European Commission more room for maneuver in trying to launch legal actions in the future against member states who fail to comply with those standards related to public media, private media, and the safety of journalists. So I will only mention, and that was the last remark for now, that the European Commission's legal response to this media freedom backsliding in Central Europe was underwhelming, and there was only one case started against a member state, Hungary, concerning not renewing a license to a private independent media station, Klub Radio, in Hungary. And now I'm giving floor to another speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this overview and for walking us through the process. Indeed, if we want to see the legislation finalized or at least brought to final stages before the European parliamentary elections, then the timeline is fairly tight. So roughly there's half a year to go. So we are very much in a hotspot, monitoring the changes and seeing where it's headed. I would pass the floor now to Konrad, and at EY, you obviously have a rather close look at the developments around this dossier. How do you see the current state of the legislation, the draft itself? What do you see as its strengths, weaknesses? Where do you think we need to pay close attention to?
Thank you, Gigi. It's a great pleasure to be here. I would probably start with a brief overview of the Media Pluralism Monitor and what it says about the main problems of media freedom in Europe, because it shows how connected this Media Freedom Act is to what we've been doing and what we've been researching in the past 10 years. So as Anna has mentioned it, the Media Pluralism Monitor is one of the tools financed by the European Commission to assess the state of media freedom and to help improve media freedom in Europe. It's also one of the main sources of the European Commission's Rule of Law report. And yeah, so as such, it is one of the main tools that show that that independent media as a guarantor of a strong and healthy democracy is a key priority for the EU's policy making. And this Media Pluralism Monitor is based on a questionnaire of 200 questions. We have country teams, expert teams in every country, and these 200 questions are grouped in 4 areas. The first one is called fundamental protection, and it maps the legal environment, self-regulation, and the safety of journalists. Then we have issues related to the media market, issues related to political independence, and finally the area of social inclusiveness, which covers the representation of minorities, media literacy, disinformation, and some other issues. And we could see that the greatest risks for the past years have always been in the market area, followed by political independence. So we have seen that huge issues were recorded when it comes to the revenues of news media, which are constantly declining. Newsrooms are closing or cutting their workforce all over Europe. There is a lack of job security. The working conditions of freelancers and employed journalists are also precarious. At the same time, we see that online intermediaries like Facebook or Google become dominant players on the advertising market. Media concentration is growing all over Europe. And of course, we hear a lot about commercial and political influences or pressures over content that is being published. The term media capture is often used also in the European context. It refers to situations in which even privately owned and market financed media can be under the control of vested interest. And we also see the spread of disinformation, attacks and threats against journalists, and especially female journalists, as common issues. And the problems are getting more severe in new EU member states. So as Anna already mentioned, countries that joined the EU 19 years ago or even later have more problems. And here we see issues related to the independence of public service media, news agencies, and media regulators. I mean, all these institutions seem to be compromised in some of these countries. We see new forms of media capture appearing. We saw that in one country, journalists were surveyed by spyware. We see that strategic lawsuits against public participation, SLAPPs, have a significant chilling effect on newsrooms. So these are all huge problems, and many of them were included in the text of the European Media Freedom Act. And so looking at the text of the EMFA, we see that that these issues that we highlighted are, so we see that it highlights that the Commission is well aware of the fact that news media are a special good. So they offer products that are monetized, but at the same time they're also producing public goods. So it's a special situation, and therefore we cannot go on with what has been done in the past, where we just fought as the media, as market players that will be sustained by the market, but a new intervention is needed. And I think the EMFA is one of the first or the most important policy documents that makes it clear that this change has to be taken seriously. Overall, my organization welcomes the EMFA. We agree that a harmonized intervention in the market is needed to avoid fragmentation of domestic regulations. We also believe that the choice of regulation instead of a directive is a good approach. It can complement the corpus of new regulations and directives that were introduced by the Commission or proposed by the Commission lately to strengthen democracies. And I think I won't talk any longer because we will have another round. I would probably only emphasize that one problem that I would emphasize at this point is that, as mentioned, the greatest problems of news media today are related to the financing models, that the financing of news media has collapsed and new forms of sustainable revenues are needed. And this aspect is not yet addressed properly in the Media Freedom Act. So that would be an important takeaway, and the rest we can discuss in the second round. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Konrad. And also thank you very much for highlighting some of the key challenges. Of course, it's good to note and good to also hear that the proposal of the Commission has been addressing some of those challenges that you have found across the European Union. Something that I will want to come back to, and you will of course address that from the aspect of your countries, whether the differences across the European Union are really captured and reflected in the EMFA, but we can keep it for a discussion. Boriana, I would like to pass the floor to you now. And this introductory question is pretty much the same to you. So where do you see strengths and weaknesses of this new legislation?
Thank you very much. Yeah, in general, I agree with Konrad and Anna that this is an important step forward into providing safeguards for independent journalism and the journalism safety across Europe. And as Anna mentioned earlier, there are huge discrepancies between the the countries where media freedom is thriving and the so-called bad boys in the European Union, where, media freedom has been under threat for years. Unfortunately, I am a practicing journalist, so I've been working as a reporter for more than 15 years now in one of those countries. So I do think, not because you invited us and I'm one of the speakers, but I do think it's crucial to talk about these discrepancies and how the Media Freedom Act can impact differently countries in Western Europe, where again, independent media is much stronger, and in the Central European corner of Europe, where problems like lack of transparency when it comes to media ownership, threats and attacks on independent journalists, smear campaigns against independent journalists, a lack of media pluralism, using media regulators and actually even state institutions to repress and silence journalists who are doing their jobs. These are some of the problems that journalists in Eastern Europe have been experiencing for years. And unfortunately, so Bulgaria joined the EU in 2007. That latest wave of EU member states. And unfortunately, media freedom wasn't part of the negotiation process. And I think, as Anna and Konrad already stressed, the European Commission is learning that maybe this is a miss on their behalf, given what's happening again in Hungary, in Poland, also in Bulgaria. Just to give you a quick example of the media landscape in the country, so you're very well familiar what's happening in Hungary. Unfortunately, Bulgaria is not far behind it. According to this year's Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders that Anna also cited, Bulgaria is just one place ahead of Hungary. And again, those problems have been a major issue for journalists who want to do public service journalism in the country. So I think is a very good step that the Commission is finally addressing some of those issues. Again, I think we should welcome the attention when it comes to transparency of media ownership, newsroom independence, introducing some safeguards when it comes to interference into editorial policy, as well as introducing maybe some rules of how state subsidies or advertising is being spent. And for example, in Bulgaria, we've been in this loop of never-ending elections. We just had our fifth in almost 2 years. That happened a month ago, basically. So we have a number of caretaker governments over this course of time. Unfortunately, none of the major parties consider media freedom a priority. And again, this is painful given the state of the media in the country. So maybe an initiative as this one coming from Brussels will be a way to force politicians and political leaders in the country to finally pay attention. Because right now, with the exceptions of a few media organizations and some media experts, this is basically not a topic in the country. And while we should welcome those efforts, I think we should also pay attention of how certain articles or areas in the Media Freedom Act can actually backfire in Eastern Europe, because so far, politicians like Orban in this part of the world have been notoriously known for taking advantage and loopholes by in legislation introduced by Brussels and actually using them as tools to further their illiberal agenda, or to further, in this case, oppression of media in the country. And I think it will be important to summarize some of these dangers that we see, or some articles that needs to be strengthened or framed much more precisely, so they are not open to interpretation for, again, political leaders who not only don't want to improve media freedom in their countries, but they actually want to use media, and especially public service media, to, again, repress journalists and to use them as propaganda and mouthpieces of their power structures. And I think I'll stop here, so we have more time for discussions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Boriana, and we will definitely get back to you as well on further details about the Bulgarian case. In the meantime, I would like to encourage our audience to use the Q&A or the chat function, as you like, to pose your questions to our speakers. As you see, we have a great coverage of the topic with experts of various profiles from the scholarly world through monitoring, as well as a practicing journalist. So this is a great opportunity to put forward your questions as well. After our second round, I will also pose your questions to our speakers. But before that, after this overview about the developing draft legislation, I would like to ask all three of you, starting first with Konrad, how you see the new legislation as it stands now, really addressing the problems of media pluralism and freedom in the case of Hungary. Do you think it really captures what's going wrong? Can it really provide solutions? What should we really expect from the legislation? Any changes would happen in the media landscape in Hungary once this is passed?
Thank you. Well, it's hard to say. Gábor Polyák, who's a professor at the AUTHLIB University in Budapest, who's one of our co-authors for the Media Pluralism Monitor's Hungary report this year, he wrote an interesting piece for Verfassungsblog in Germany, where he argued that in the context of Hungary, the EMFA doesn't go far enough, while for Western Europe, it just goes too far. I think he's a bit too pessimistic, because at the same time, we can see from the reactions of the Hungarian government-affiliated actors that they seem to dislike the EMFA. And if the EMFA has no impact at all, then they would probably not even deal with it. So it might have some impact, and I feel like many of the issues that are in the text really grasp the situation in Hungary. Like, for example, the issue of state advertising is only in the text, or we only know about it because it's a huge problem in Hungary, and I think also in Poland and in Bulgaria. But it's not, I mean, if you would ask a regular German, or even someone who, even a German journalist, whether they know what state advertising is, they would probably don't even understand the concept of it. So in this sense, it's a reaction to the Hungarian reality. But it's questionable whether it will really solve the situation with state advertising. For example, here, Gábor Polyák argues that the EMFA is mainly providing transparency requirements. For now, we know, I think, basically everything about state advertising. Journalists have covered it. We know how much advertising goes to the government supportive or pro-government media and how much goes to non-supportive media, basically nothing. We see that some print publications in Hungary get like 80% of their incomes from state advertising. So basically it's quite clear that state advertising is an indirect or covered subsidy in the country. But what would happen if we would make it more transparent? Wouldn't there be a loophole anyway that the government would use? Maybe they would ask some intermediaries to make the decisions about placing advertising, or if they would have to allocate it proportionally to all news media. Maybe they would come up with an idea, let's say, to put to put a message in every media saying George Soros is a threat to our country, and then all the independent media can make a decision whether they really want to publish government propaganda in exchange for indirect subsidies or not. Maybe they won't. So in this sense, I'm not sure if it really provides a solution. And also, I don't want to advertise the Hungarian government, but in many ways, they are really smart when it comes to making policies, or as Boriana said, finding loopholes. And currently, we have seen that for the last 2 years almost, we have a new head of the Hungarian media regulator who's also a scholar himself, and he is actually a really good scholar. Based on the interviews he gave in the past year or so, it looks like he really started thinking about coming up with his own theory of how media freedom can be understood in the Hungarian context, how there is a special Hungarian kind of media freedom. Or he said that actually independent media doesn't exist at all because all media are dependent. So maybe they will find a way around this regulation, if this regulation comes to existence, or they will just not comply with it. That's also an issue, as we have seen with the decisions of the European Court of Justice, which I think for the last 10 years, the Hungarian Commission Hungary didn't react to, I think, 80% of the judgments made by the European Court of Justice. So in this context, the Media Freedom Act sounds great, and I hope it would have some impact, but there's also a chance that the Hungarian government won't comply. And I think that was also in part voiced by Vice President of the Commission, Vera Jourova, who said that you cannot unscramble scrambled eggs. So many of the things that have already happened in Hungary, that are already problems there, they won't be solved by the EMFA. Maybe future problems could be solved, and maybe if the EMFA was there in 2010, then we wouldn't be there in that situation where we are now in Poland and Hungary and in Bulgaria. So in that sense, it will be great for Slovakia or for the Czech Republic if they get a new populist government at some point in the future. They will be much safer than these countries. But maybe for the 3 countries covered here, we need some proposal that goes even further. I think that's what I would say for now. And then, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Konrad. Boriana, you already mentioned that overall, it's a step forward to have EMFA. what are the key challenges that you think it may be able to tackle in the case of Bulgaria, and where do you see it's still maybe lacking or falling short?
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Conrad that if we had a similar piece of legislation maybe back in 2010, we wouldn't be witnessing what now we see as demise of media freedom in the region. And that's very sad, because actually Hungarian fellow journalists were raising the alarm for years. But in a way, nobody, including politicians in Brussels, wanted to hear them out unless it was too late. So I agree with him that maybe this is a good step forward for preventing media freedom backsliding in this regard, but it will be no silver bullet to solve all the problems that we are already seeing in like being widespread in countries like, again, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland. Because not just Orban, but like populist politicians are very talented in, again, finding creative ways to use and to capture media and to use it as, and to turn it into a propaganda tool. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen in Bulgaria as well. For example, when it comes to media ownership in the country, the legislation actually obliges publications to disclose their actual owners to the public. There's a registry within the Ministry of Culture, and each media outlet have to provide this information to the public. But what happens in reality is that this law is good on paper, but nobody enforces or supervises what actually happens. And unlike in Hungary, where we know that Orban basically controls much of the media in the country, unfortunately, in Bulgaria, this is much more obscure and sometimes even hard to track. I authored a report on media capture in Bulgaria, and trust me, it was really, really hard to explain the links or some of the dependencies of those media outlets, because again, we don't know where the actual money is coming from. On the registry, you might have one name, but in reality, there are links to politicians or businessmen, etc. So the Media Freedom Act could be just one pan-European legislation that kind of tries to introduce very well-intended changes, but if they're not enforcement, if they're not close monitoring, if there isn't implementation that the European Commission is closely following and observing on national level, I'm afraid that this will just be wishful thinking, and that won't have any actual results or help solve the problems in this country. Or just to highlight one more example, the creation of this EU level board, that the original idea was to include a member of each national media council. Well, again, I think I'm not only speaking about Bulgaria, but also in Hungary and Poland. Those media councils, media regulators have been captured for years now. In Bulgaria, they have been politicized. We even currently have a chair of the Media Council who is criticized for attacking independent journalists, or even deemed as spreading disinformation. So will be that a representative of independent media in Brussels? I'm not sure what's the answer to that question. And again, the governments, well, previous governments in the country have been abusing, channeling state or even EU funds advertising towards certain media outlets in exchange of friendly coverage. So there are some provisions in the Media Freedom Act that want to tackle this issue, but if there are not measures and some penalties and enforcement of those measures, there will be just, again, good on paper, but not actually changing the media freedom landscape for the better in those countries.
Thank you very much, Boriana. Some of the issues that you raised, I think, indeed are very much regional phenomena, or maybe not even regional. We should not generalize to that extent, but certainly in the countries where we observe democratic backsliding, problems of media capture tend to be alike. So specifically what you mentioned about the national regulators, I think indeed that's a problem across the board, and this will be something that I think we might come back a little bit later. Moving on to Anna, you worked a lot on the media challenges to media freedom pluralism in Poland, and specifically on EMFA. How do you see the potential of this legislation for the country?
Mm-hmm. So the EMFA is very broad, and it really covers a lot of issues. And some of those issues, as we mentioned, they're just concern media in general and what happens to media, the challenges related to the dominance of big platforms, social media. So for instance, we will find in this act also some rules on how social media should react to new media publishers when their content is taken down, and that they should have some redress and fast. And also there are other issues that relate, for instance, to common European audience measurements. So it's really broad. But on the other hand, we've seen that there are several or even a dozen of articles that pertain specifically to the problems that we encounter and that Konrad and Borina had already mentioned. And in the case of Poland, I will maybe discuss it like per problem. So one problem that we have is the capture of media regulators. And in Poland, the National Broadcasting Council and the National Media Council, the two bodies, were both filled with basically political power appointees, and they take active role in lowering media freedom standards. So they do it, for example, by toying with renewing broadcast licenses or giving disproportionate fines to private media for their reporting. So, for instance, in Poland, people who have previously made repeatedly public negative statements about specific media service providers are today the heads of media regulators. And one feature of the Polish rule of law backsliding, or the Polish government, is that it's not as shrewd as the Hungarian one. It just goes all out and creates conflicts everywhere, and it's like very transparent in its democratic backsliding, also in appointing a very controversial person to the head of the media regulator. So the European Media Freedom Act says that the independence of media regulators should be ensured, and it repeats actually the standards that already exist in EU binding regulation, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive in Article 30. And the problem is that the European Commission has not been doing much to enforce those standards that are already binding. So here we see a repetition, a dangerous repetition. And then the Act will establish a European media board that would be comprised of persons from the national media regulators. So then the question arises how the board would insulate from basically people who are engaged in media freedom deterioration on the ground, and whether the boards would not be hijacked. And then the problem with the European Media Board is also that Western European states may not want to give the board too much power, and member states from Eastern Europe may actually want to give it some power because they will expect that it will be hijacked anyway. So another issue is the problem of public media capture, so that cronies are appointed to management positions in public media, and then public media produces awful propaganda, and media regulators do not fine it, do not sanction it for that, because they are also part of the whole power structure. So here there would be certain standards. Article recognizes the importance of the independence of public service media management and stipulates that the appointment procedure should be laid down in law in advance, be transparent, open, and non-discriminatory. And that's all fine, but still I don't see how it will practically prevent appointing certain people that will then do what the political power wants. The third problem is private media capture, and it was already mentioned several times. So the EMFA will establish the European Media Board, and member states will be required to make media concentration impact assessments. So the decision making about media concentrations will be taken on EU level in a sense, because the Commission will issue guidelines to be considered at the national level. And there were numerous competition issues in takeover of Polska Press Group in Poland in 2021 by Orlen, which is a state-controlled oil and gas company, the biggest in the region, actually. And the takeover concerned more than 20 regional print dailies, hundreds of online portals, and basically a media empire that is now in the hands of the government. So the next problem mentioned already by Boriana is that the governments are funding private media that are friendly to them, and they are financing them from public funds. And EMFA in Article 24 provides rules enhancing transparency and fairness in the allocation of state advertising to media outlets. So it is important to include not only national authorities, but also local authorities. And then the question basically pertains to what is public funding and what criteria will we put into this, because there are various ways to channel public funding and just name it differently. And then the another problem is that the media will provide reports about, and also public authorities will provide reports to national media regulators about the funding distribution. But then if we have a hijacked media regulator, I mean, this report will amount to basically nothing. One of the last problems is that, but a really big one, is that the governments are making it more difficult for private media that are independent of government and that criticize the government to operate. So the member states will be required to carry out a test on impact of new measures on media freedom and pluralism. But the problem is that the media pluralism is not defined under the Act. And it is written that the test would concern any new legislative measure, regulation, or administrative measure, and that the European Commission can ask the European Media Board to provide an opinion on these measures. And this opinion will be obligatory in cases of concentration issues. But so I would suggest that the list of obligatory topics should be made much longer, and it should include also questions related to renewing or not renewing broadcasting licenses, changes in ownership structure regulations, and new reporting and financial statements required from nonprofits, media nonprofits. And this is just like a short list. So I would say that we've seen certain positive or hopeful elements of the Act, but still a lot of depends on enforcement and whether the governments or national institutions will not be able to actually pass under the scrutiny of European Media Board and other EU institutions.
Thank you very much, Anna. I would now like to ask our speakers if they would like to immediately react to each other.
I mean,
yeah.
maybe I can add something. Yeah, because and to the point that Anna made, that in in certain provisions, Western countries might want, let's say, the board not to have such a big power, while it's in Eastern Europe, they might see it differently. And also something that might work in Germany, even though they're one of the countries that are kind of not happy with the current Media Freedom Act, or something that might benefit the media freedom there might backfire in countries like Bulgaria, Hungary, or Poland. And also, I think it's good to think and to ask ourselves, what will be the impact of some of those provisions in a country where, as you mentioned, there is democratic backsliding, where the judiciary is often captured or not functioning when there isn't independent judiciary, and where there aren't the necessary check and balances to make sure democracy is working, but also to protect journalists. I think, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but again, just follow up on what Anna said about the enforcement and closely monitoring how these proposals are working in Eastern Europe. There might just be another tool to further deteriorate, unfortunately, media freedom in the country. Not of course by Brussels, but by local governments. So we do need more precision, more enforcement, more like shrinking the area, the wiggle room where national governments can loosely interpret some of those provisions.
Thank you very much. I would like to encourage our audience to put in their questions, comments into the chat. But before moving on to the questions from the audience, I would like to still stick with this topic of enforcement and a board a little more, and ask you, like, all three of you were really mentioning that the key issue will be enforcement, whether yes, this new directive would really have an impact. Now, being fully aware of the creativity of certain governments that have been finding loopholes in various legislation, how do you see, or what do you think could be done to strengthen enforcement? What kind of tools could potentially be added here to ensure compliance? And maybe combining this question with what we've been discussing about the board. What do you think would be the optimal role for this European Board of Media Services, and how the hijacking of it could be prevented? Would any of you want to jump in on this? Anna, please.
Yes, so I would say that the optimal idea of the board is to equip it with significant ability to issue opinions on its own initiative, because there is this requirement that the European Commission will ask the board to issue opinions. And that's basically another advisory body to the European Commission. And we know that sometimes the European Commission has a lot of information and sometimes doesn't want to act. So this is also problematic with the board. And I would say that the board, I mean, there are various ideas. So for instance, one problem with the board is that in the countries where you have like one constitutional media regulator and another one set up that doubles on its function, and Poland is such a country. So who will be basically selected to the media board if there is only one person per country? And I heard people speaking or trying to like brainstorm certain ideas. So for instance, that the board should be actually bigger and that there should be one person appointed per country from the government or by the government or public authorities, and the other one by civil society or some associations, representatives of media. But that is also problematic because in many countries there are like several NGOs, and also there are like those gongos that are actually, you know, the arms of the state, just under the guise of civil society organization. So even on like an operational level, it's quite difficult to imagine how we could make this board better. But definitely, in my opinion, it should be mandated, required to consult civil society as broadly as it can, just to have an input from non-governmental organizations that are really independent and pluralistic. And it should try to make those assessments in all member states using like same criteria or like a checklist, so that we do not have the situation that was common during the rule of law backsliding, when Hungary and Poland objected to any measures taken by European institutions because they said that they are just picked, and bigger, richer member states are not being scrutinized as much. And for instance, the European Commission's response was to create those rule of law reports that discuss situation in 27 countries. So yeah, I would see more discussion about the European Media Board, but I would rather, as a person coming from a country that is undergoing the rule of law backsliding and that sees the EU's involvement as something good and providing actually a check and balance over our institutions, I would see a more robust and equipped board.
Thank you very much, Anna. Oriana, Conrad, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Maybe not on the board, but the other issue that you mentioned. So what else could be or should be in the board in the EMFA to make it more effective? I mean, I would think that, and I think I already alluded to that before. I mean, one important thing would be to empower independent media in Europe. So not only so for example, when it comes to the part of the EMFA which talks about state advertising, it seems like the text accepts the fact that state advertising is a kind of indirect subsidy in some European countries, instead of having a broader view and saying that instead of state advertising, maybe countries that see their media system struggle or their media outlets struggling should have a subsidy scheme where you have transparent and fair allocation of funds for all media. Maybe there could also be an EU level fund for independent media outlets. I mean, there are some grants that we've already seen in the Creative Europe program, some investigative cross-border grants, but it's far from enough. Maybe we could also discuss a tax on Google and Facebook, so that that could be used to strengthen independent media. And maybe another issue that is a bit missing from the EMFA is the view on new non-traditional actors. So we have a new definition of media service providers in the text, which is broader as what we had in the Audiovisual Media Services Act, but it still doesn't take into consideration that a lot of information now comes from, I don't know, bloggers or just public authorities. Like during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that the WHO was often as such shared by people as a source of information. So there is a that also provides a lot of opportunity for these governments that we are talking about to use new actors to spread their messages. If the media environment is regulated, then maybe they will have an alternative shadow information environment. And that's also something that we could see already in the last election in Hungary, that there has been an increased there has been increased governmental support to new online players, like different influencers and other smart pro-government people who share their knowledge and opinion about the words or try to influence people in a way. And for example, if in the future the government cannot use state advertising to support its media, maybe it can use it to support influencers, because in a way this whole issue of state advertising is not the most modern issue. A lot of outlets that are financed by the Hungarian state are outlets that are read by 5,000 people or 10,000 people who are already great supporters of the government. So they wouldn't really lose by, well, some people would lose their position. Maybe they would become influencers afterwards. But other than that, the government itself wouldn't really lose its informational sphere by losing state advertisement. So I think we have to think of these new players as well when we think of improving the EMFA.
Thank you very much, Konrad. These are really great points, but it also kind of makes me wonder whether the legislation will just keep on running after these sort of creative practices of autocratizing governments. And if so, then what can we really do? Boriana, do you still want to jump in on this round?
Yeah, maybe just as a quick follow-up. Yeah, in Bulgaria, a lot of those like state funding or even EU funding has been channeled to tabloid style, kind of offenders of basic journalistic rules. So in addition to kind of very detailed and transparent criteria of how to distribute state funds or advertising, it could be added that outlets who are like biggest offenders when it comes to ethics and again following basic principles of fair, objective, etc. reporting are not allowed to receive such funds, which again hasn't been the case in Bulgaria in the past. Even though it's publicly known that these outlets have been one of the biggest offenders of journalistic and media standards, and even they have been used as tools to smear and tarnish investigative journalists and independent media outlets, still some of the funds were sent their way. And yeah, to what Anna said about the board, I very much agree. Again, a list of criteria, very clear, comprehensive criteria, which basically guarantee that independent either media experts or journalists will become members of this board should be developed. And I agree with her, it's much more complicated on the ground than it seems on paper. So sometimes even, journalistic associations, there are a few of them. And if you don't know the local context, you might easily be fooled or get lost. But that's why maybe it's important to have like the media pluralism test be obligatory and not just a recommendation, and also just make sure that of the integrity and independence of the members who make it to the board.
Thank you very much. And directly connecting to this issue of the board, I would like to bring in one of the questions. Somebody from our audience is asking whether you think an EU-wide supervisory board that is comprised of journalists, representatives of Free Journalists Association, experts on media law, would make sense to bring about in a way to support the implementation of the Media Freedom Act. Would you see room for such an initiative? And if so, how would it make sense to obviously avoid duplications and maybe just setting up one more monitoring body that writes report is not the most useful thing, but do you see space for this? If anybody wants to take this question.
I mean, I would say that maybe Anna kind of already answered that question a little bit. But yeah, again, developing very transparent and detailed rules of how are those members elected, and not just pick one member of the National Media Council. So I personally, I do think that this makes sense. But again, making sure of the integrity of those board members, as well as having a track record of somebody respected in the country or in the media field.
Mm-hmm. I think the question was more about having something parallel to the European Media Board, but indeed, Anna was mentioning that broadening the kind of membership of who can sit on that European Media Board would make sense. So if I take it correctly, then you would generally be supportive of that idea rather than having some parallel structures.
If I may add a sentence or two, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how this would look like, but in my head, I could imagine having such a supervisory board or advisory board set up by, let's say, the European Federation of Journalists or some other non-governmental organization, or maybe as a coalition of non-governmental organizations who choose like a group of, I don't know, 20 people who would then act as independent independent entities who have a look at what the board is doing and maybe identify some additional issues that weren't really dealt with by the board, and that could provide some extra level of scrutiny. So, but maybe it would be too expensive. I don't know. But if it's not super expensive, and if there are capacities for that, why not? It could be useful, and maybe it would also increase public attention on this issue. So, in that sense, I could support that.
Thank you very much, Konrad. I would maybe jump on this last thing that you mentioned, capturing and maybe increasing public attention. You three are all very familiar with your national context. How do you see EMFA being perceived both by the public, if there is at least some visibility to the issue on the public level, or how do you see it being perceived by local stakeholders in your respective countries? Are there any mobilization, attention to the issue, and what is the potential of that?
If I can just say one sentence, because from my side, it's really just one sentence. I didn't see any attention from the Hungarian public. I probably saw like 2 newspaper articles dealing with it, but didn't see too many likes on them. And not even journalists seem to know about it, or seem to I don't know, maybe they think that it's not a huge issue, or maybe they are just in this mindset that there was so much promise coming from the European Union for the last 10 years and nothing really happened. So maybe they are disillusioned, but I feel like outside of this Brussels bubble or EU policy bubble, no one knows about it.
How do things look in Poland, Anna?
So in January, the Chamber of Press Publishers issued a statement that actually welcomes and congratulates the Commission on such a great idea on protecting media freedom and pluralism, but has certain questions and raises controversies. And this is very much in line with concerns of publishers in, say, Germany or France over the interference into editorial freedom. So I would say that media publishers are mostly concerned about the standards related to ensuring editorial independence by media owners. And this is something that all media publishers have been stressing in the past couple of months. So this is not very much different from other countries. And aside from that, in this statement, they also reject the idea of the European Media Board with very broad competences and suggest that a European ombudsman on media freedom would be created, and that would be an independent institution that would hear individual complaints and act on the individual complaints regarding freedom of expression infringements. And another idea, or I would say a call, is that any European act should include obligation that social media platforms, big providers, are obliged to be taxed in the European Union member states. So these are, quite concrete proposals, and they only try to ensure that the interests of their shareholders will not be impacted too much.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, I don't think that the picture is very different in Bulgaria, with the exception of a handful of news stories talking about the European Media Freedom Act and some specialized discussions that probably were attended only by journalists and media experts. I could only speculate at this point, but I don't think if we go out onto the street and do kind of an improvised vox pop and just stop some random people and ask them if they know or if they ever heard about the European Media Freedom Act, that will get a lot of people who are familiar with it, actually. So maybe that's something that we need to work on as well, so this doesn't remain just another piece of legislation that people don't understand that comes from Brussels. Maybe there should be some kind of a promotion campaign is maybe, I'm not sure if it's the right word, but explaining to people why it's important, what the goal of the act is, etc., etc. So people understand its importance or its significance, basically.
Thank you very much. I would again encourage our audience to share your questions. We still have about 15 minutes, so plenty of time for a couple more rounds. I would move on with the questions that we have received, and specifically maybe focus on its perception, the EMFA's perception in the European Parliament. So it has been mentioned before that this is now in the phase of committee discussions. Indeed, the May 5th was the deadline for submitting amendments, so just last week. How do you see the draft's perception among MEPs? And linking to one of the questions from our audience, what are your thoughts on proposals of some MEPs, private actors, to separate the EMFA in a directive and a regulation, therefore to split it up, if you have any impressions of that? Would anybody like to jump in on this? If not, then maybe I would add to this question and broaden it a little bit further. So we were talking about the perceptions of the EMFA in Hungary, Bulgaria, and Poland. And Konrad, you mentioned in your introductory statement a quote from Gábor Polyák that this legislation might not be enough for Central Europe, but might go too far when it comes to Western Europe. So although we are specifically focusing here on the countries on Central Europe, what have you picked up on when it comes to other parts of the European Union? How happy are other countries or potentially other stakeholders with this draft legislation, both member states or organizations in the media landscape, if you have any impressions on that?
I mean, personally, my impression is that at least those MEPs who we were in touch with, they were really, they knew a lot. They were interested in how to improve it. So they had a really positive position on it. I can imagine that there are some MEPs, especially from Western European countries, who would want to water it down, especially when it comes to the parts about editorial integrity and stuff like that, which I wouldn't support, but I can imagine that it might be an issue. And then there has been a lot of discussion, at least in that bubble that we're in, about Article 17, which is basically part 2 of the saga of the so-called media exemption. It was already an issue that came up in the context of the Digital Services Act, that basically some media outlets or outlets that are self-identifying as media would be exempt of content moderation on online platforms. So on these issues, there might be controversies related to the issue of turning it into partly a directive and partly so that's partly a regulation, partly a directive. I'm not sure if it makes sense. That there might be some sense behind it, because I saw that the European Federation of Journalists also argued in favor of that. But it would probably make it a bit complicated if we have a regulation, a directive, and then a recommendation as well. So for me, it doesn't really make sense, because the recommendation itself seemed to work quite well, but I'm not a lawyer, so maybe from a lawyer's point of view, there might be an argument for that. So yeah, these were the things that came to my mind.
Thank you very much, Konrad. Boriana, Anna, would you like to add anything to this?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not a legal expert either. I'm just a journalist, so yeah, I don't think I can add anything to what already Konrad said.
No worries. Anna, anything on this one?
Yes, well, I would say that there are several legal issues in the act that warrant our attention, in addition to Article 20 that includes these requirements of the proportionality test that are actually also interesting to be seen in the light of the case law of the European Court of Human Rights on certain media freedom issues. We also have problems related to ensuring the access to adequate judicial protection under EU law, because the Act also refers to the right of media service providers to have the right to court, basically, protected under Article 19 of the treaty. And in several EU member states, notably in Poland, the right to such court is not guaranteed because of all the rule of law backsliding, judicial independence related changes that were made in recent years, and they are confirmed by the Court of Justice of the EU, the European Court of Human Rights, EU institutions, etc. So we see that there is still a lot of, I would say, background work or maybe work related to explanations, how to clarify certain standards and making them operational, because indeed there are more questions in the Act for now.
Thank you very much, Anna. And thank you also for touching on the issue of Article 20. This was indeed a question of one of the participants in the audience. Quickly checking if we managed to tackle all questions so far, and I would again encourage our audience to use the remaining few minutes to put forward any questions. We have had a question coming in regarding whether EMFA can in any way support or acknowledge specifically the role of local independent media in upholding media pluralism, supporting media pluralism. Do you see such potential for the Act, such level of differentiation?
I think it's a good question. I don't know if the European Media Freedom Act is the place where this should be addressed, but I do think it's very crucial because at least in Bulgaria, regional media, like media outside of the capital, which covers certain cities or regions in the country, they have been in decline for years now. Actually, in some areas, we find what we call news deserts, because there isn't like a single newspaper or online platform that does original reporting. I wouldn't call a media outlet some internet site that just copy paste government or like local government's press releases, etc. And what we see in Bulgaria is actually the dependencies of the very few still existing local media in small towns is much greater on local governments and local businesses. So the handful of independent journalists who are still doing investigative journalism, still uncovering abuse of power or misuse of taxpayers' money, we're still daring to actually do the job of every good journalism, has been a target of vexatious lawsuits or the so-called slaps, libel lawsuits, or even threats. So it's really, I think, worrisome what's happening outside of the capital cities. And again, I don't know if the Media Freedom Act is the one to address those issues, but as Konrad mentioned earlier, I would love to see I don't know, funding schemes or more grants or opportunities for regional media to get funding so they can further develop like public interest journalism.
Thank you very much. Anna, please go ahead.
Yes, I would say I have changed my opinion on how to support journalism in the regions in the past months because of experience of regranting by one Polish media organization of grants to local media organizations. And actually, it was quite difficult to find quality and committed media organizations. And I would say that it seems that in such countries as Poland, which are actually quite big and has several regions, still the current rules on the market is rather that people are interested in very professional media operations, and they feel that their local stories are somehow elevated when they are covered by national news. And it's how the news works. Like national news can also be interested and are vitally interested in uncovering corruption, fraud, scandals in the regions and in small towns. So since I've seen that there was such a big effort put into making those, connections with local media outlets that were understaffed, and sometimes the quality of their editing, reporting was not amazing. And I also say it in the light of the fact that the Polish government-controlled company bought the group of biggest regional dailies, but they also had like big problems in terms of circulations. Basically, they couldn't survive on the market. So my idea would be actually to maybe incentivize or provide some programs for successful media, independent media, especially non-profits, to hire more local journalists or to commission more local stories or to try to send their reporters to various corners of the countries following certain topics, right? Because I think that would work better, because the other solution was just, at least in Poland, it proved very difficult to have really good outcomes. But I see that this is a problem. So we shouldn't have any news deserts, and we should have greater coverage, professional coverage, more investigative journalism in general. And this investigative journalism should by no means focus on the capital.
Thank you very much, Anna. I see from your hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so about this local media issue, I wanted to add that I think some of the articles of EMFA could apply, of course, to local journalists as well. So local journalists shouldn't be surveyed by Pegasus spyware either, or stuff like that. So these things apply to the EMFA, to local journalism as well. But I feel like sometimes there are loopholes in the text that are not too advantageous for local journalists, and that's, for example, in the case of state advertising, where the text said that the municipalities that have less than 1 million inhabitants are exempt from the rules about state advertising. So that means that the government cannot support. So let's say, for example, in Hungary, the government itself cannot support its cronies through state advertising, but a mayor of a city, of basically any city outside of Budapest, can still use public funds to support its friendly media. I think that's not a good approach, and this loophole has to be abolished. Then I think I would agree with what Boriana said, that it's funding that should be the main approach. So trying to support these independent media, especially because the advertising market doesn't doesn't really seem to work in the local environment, especially in countries like Hungary, where I'm not even sure if in Hungary the local media that exists, the independent local media, can be seen as media in the traditional sense, because many of them have only one employee. It's usually people who were fired by fired from these captured local media outlets. So it's basically one person fighting against the whole corrupt establishment in that country. So is that person now an activist, a journalist, a one-person NGO? Does he or she fall under the EMFA or not anymore? So that's something that we have to think about a bit more. Maybe if they would join together as an association, or I don't know, like if we would have one group that would bring together all local media, all these independent local media, and they would apply together for funds as 12 media outlets covering 12 cities, that could be more effective for them as well, because from what we see in terms of grant making, we don't have the kinds of grants that would suit a one-person organization. We usually have grant makers who say we have 50,000 euros for this country, so apply. If you're one person in a country like Hungary, that's just too much money for you to spend. And supporting just one media in the whole country or one local media in the country is not enough when there are probably 12 or 18 localities. And maybe at the end, I would also make a short advertisement for one of our projects that was just launched. It's called Local Media for Democracy. It's a project of the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom, together with the Journalism Fund and the European Federation of Journalists, and I think I forgot someone, but anyway, it's about news deserts and local media. It has two components, a grant-making component where we provide grants to local media all over Europe, and a research component, which is basically a tiny version of the Media Pluralism Monitor, 30 questions or 50 questions that try to better understand the problem of news deserts in Europe and the problems of local media, because probably there are completely different problems in France, Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria when it comes to local media, because in some countries, local media are just struggling, but still kind of having 10,000 or 20,000 readers who still pay for their contents. And then we have other countries where you just have some renegades who fight the system all alone, without money, without readers. So that requires different solutions.
Thank you very much, Konrad. And I'm really glad that we are actually closing with this question, because I think this was a perfect way to move us beyond EMFA as well. Of course, that is what our conversation today was focusing on. But of course, and as all three of you have highlighted it, this is not a silver bullet. And in fact, this is most likely not going to solve some of the key challenges that we are facing in Central Europe, particularly in Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary. So indeed, moving beyond the new European legislative framework is essential, and various forms of support for independent media to strengthen media freedom and media pluralism in these countries will be also central. So thank you very much for bringing in your thoughts also on potential further instruments that we could focus on. All three of you have mentioned your ideas about potential funding for independent journalism that can definitely go beyond the scope of EMFA. And I would say this is where we would leave it for today, and hopefully pick it up in the not so distant future. The issue of media freedom and pluralism in Central and Eastern Europe will remain with us both generally as a challenge in political terms, but also on our agenda at the German Marshall Fund's Engaging Central Europe program, as well as the neo-authoritarianisms in Europe and the Liberal Democratic Response AUTHLIB project. I would like to encourage all of you to follow our work on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and we will certainly be in touch with you with further events and publications, both in this topic and beyond. I would like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists today. Anna, Boriana, Konrad, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. It's been especially enlightening, and even though I feel that we are left with more questions than answers, definitely these questions have been worth raising and pay attention to. So thank you so much for being here with us today, and thank you to our audience for sticking with us for the past 1.5 hours. Thank you very much. Goodbye.